Never mind the fact that this is his sister's son, his best friend's son, his freaking nephew we're talking about here. How and why did you come to the conclusion that this is a fitting portrayal of Luke Skywalker? A nutcase who was actually thinking about killing someone in their sleep, with the kind of expression you would put on the poster for a horror movie. And this was from before Luke started to hate the Jedi and want to isolate himself.
But it was the reason he isolated himself to begin with. In fact, if you recall from the first movie, everyone else said he blamed himself for Ben turning, so he probably, did, and the contemplation that led to him blaming the Jedi in their entirety for what he became likely came after the fact, when he had more direct access to the previous records of the Jedi, thus also explaining why he would leave the map to where he was in the first place.
And don't say he was preemptively trying to protect his family and the galaxy. Kylo was not a threat at this point.
Thus why this would be the time to preemptively protect his family and the galaxy. Before he could be a threat.
He didn't bother to explore any other options at all. Remember, this was also taking place from before he cut himself from the Force. Why didn't he consult with Obi-Wan or Yoda about what to do? Why didn't he try talking to Kylo himself? This goes beyond a lapse in judgment. The guy who was willing to talk to Vader and resist Palpatine telling him to kill Vader wouldn't have a problem talking with his nephew.
First of all, he outright said it was a moment of instinct, and literally the only thing he did aggressively was turn on his lightsaber. Remember the multiple times we saw the same scene? We saw it from the point of view of different people. Ben's depiction of facial expressions and Luke's were different because they saw the situation in two different ways. He had a half second of weakness, not even a full moment, and the consequences of it wound up far greater than he was prepared for. That's the real story. And again, it's really not out of character.
But no, instead he decided to go, maybe if I kill him now it'll save me the trouble. What kind of bullshit is that? I could understand this reaction if, say, Kylo was planning to kill Luke and destroy the temple and the other students beforehand. But we never see anything like that, so I can only assume that Luke led him to do this out of desperation and betrayal.
Which are valid reasons for Luke to have a knee-jerk reaction like turning on the lightsaber and immediately reconsidering his course of action. Oh, and as for nothing being shown, when Luke looks into his mind, we hear sounds of people screaming and slaughter. Yeah, he could have seen the temple burning down. Could have seen worse than that, actually.
But wait, you might add, what about when he gave into his anger and tried to kill Vader in Return of the Jedi? Well, that's not the comparison you're looking for because the direness of that situation was extremely different. It was the final battle that would determine the outcome of the war and the fate of the galaxy. Luke's friends and allies are either dying or in immediate danger. He's being cornered by two of the most evil people in the galaxy. Vader was threatening his sister, and on top of that, his training at the time was still limited, which is why he gave in to his anger.
But we don't see him training in the Force after that fight, so by your logic, it didn't happen. But realistically, he also didn't have a master, so his guidance in learning more of the ways of the Jedi and balancing himself in the Force were also much more limited than even Vader's would be, so even without your dumb logic, it still tracks.
The situation is set up in a way that Luke attacking Vader in anger is both in character and makes sense for the plot. Now let's compare that to this situation. The Republic is in power and the galaxy is stable. Luke is living a peaceful life at the Academy. Nobody was in danger. He was alone in the hut with his sleeping nephew. And he had 30 years to mature, grow wise, and practice restraint, discipline, and self-control. There were dozens of other methods he could have gone with, the situation was far less dire, and he learned to approach certain situations with better clarity.
I have an alternate interpretation of that. It's only very slightly different. How should I explain this? No, he fucking didn't. He didn't learn anything new. We don't see him learn it on camera, so, Schrodinger's character development, I guess. He literally saw visions of an overwhelming darkness inside Ben's mind, and he hasn't seen hide nor hair of the dark side to actually contend with for 30 years as far as we know. Are you sure he wouldn't panic enough to simply, as a reminder, turn the lightsaber on and do nothing else?
There was no reason for him to come to the conclusion that killing Kylo was the only viable option. And what makes it even stupider is that Luke gives up on the Jedi after Kylo became evil, despite knowing that Obi-Wan remained hopeful after Anakin became evil. Luke was more optimistic than Obi-Wan and had better faith than others, and yet he's the one who gives up more easily?
That one, I kinda give you. I agree to a certain extent, but we also don't know that his isolation was because of giving up on the Jedi in the first place. I mean, think about it. If he was giving up on the ways of the Jedi from the outset, Why the fuck did he go where all the Jedi texts are being held? Doesn't make sense, does it?
This isn't even the worst thing that's ever happened to him. His aunt and uncle getting burned to a crisp, watching his friends and allies getting blown up by Palpatine. This is supposed to be the worst thing that's ever happened to him that makes him give up all hope? I guess the fact that it was his own fault and the guilt fueling from it is supposed to be an edge, but it's built on his character being written stupidly for the sake of the plot. It's a cheap method for building drama.
Or, and hear me out here, it's just a fucking lapse of judgment, like a human would have. I'm aware you don't know how that feels, but characters do not have to make perfect, intelligent decisions at all times to be well written. Writing a character who fucks up and can't forgive themselves because they should have known better is actually an example of a well-written character. Who would have even guessed?
And you'd think it would be bad enough that Luke would disrespect his father's saber, not give a shit about Han's death, blame the old Jedi Order for something that was his own fault, and psychologically consider killing someone in their sleep. But on top of that, he's also portrayed as a coward. Isolating himself from the galaxy could have worked if the circumstances surrounding it weren't convoluted beyond belief. But his reason for isolating himself is because he stupidly decided to kill Kylo. Maybe I can understand the guilt and shame, but giving up outright and not bothering to come back and set things right? That is bullshit.
I mean, I guess, yeah, Luke is depicted as running from his problems. That's part of the point. But in this case, and I can at the very least see why you'd have a problem with that in relation to Luke's character. That one's a lot harder to justify with time too. And in my interpretation of him going to Dakar not necessarily being when he separates from the Force is one possible explanation, but I can't exactly debunk the fact that it still winds up kind of cowardly from the outset, which is something I can actually agree doesn't necessarily fit with Luke. Could argue that his reason for isolation is to look for an answer in old texts in the first place, but then he winds up disheartened when he can only find a cycle of violence. But, you know, I think that counter argument is not the strongest for this point in particular, because it's still borderline cowardice at the end of the day.
Oh, and he also cuts himself from the Force so he can't keep tabs on his sister or his best friend or any of his friends and family or the galaxy he swore to protect. He's just gonna spend the rest of his life drinking green tit milk and not thinking about the galaxy that's probably being blown to smithereens. And this is what upsets me most about Luke's characterization. Tossing the lightsaber, not reacting to Han's death, contemplating killing someone in their sleep, all of those things are small potatoes compared to Luke abandoning everything and everyone he swore to protect over a mistake that he made that he refuses to take responsibility for.
So let's examine that in isolation. So you don't like that he isolated himself over a simple mistake. Okay, have you ever been harder on yourself than what actually makes sense? I hate to break it to you, but this is actually kind of a realistic portrayal of disillusionment, which, I'm sorry, I guess I should have interjected after this instead.
Nothing about Luke's choice to isolate himself and abandon everything and leave everyone to clean up his mess makes any sense whatsoever.
Results from decisions that don't always make sense. I mean, to be fair, operating on the assumption that his hiding was intended to be full-on self-isolation the entire time and not reading old text to find an answers and not liking the answers he's given, which the timeline presented in the film actually does kind of imply. But the fact of the matter is, your interpretation of what's happened to Luke's character as depicted in these films is kind of just whining that they've given him in-character reasons to move out of the primary spotlight, when if Luke was at his best the whole time and Rey was still the main character, that would make her more of a Mary Sue. Let's face it. As much as you tried in the beginning to say that you like the idea, everything you said indicates that the problem with the idea in your eyes is the fact that Luke's the character they gave it to. Not inherently bad criticism, just one I don't agree with, and, well, more importantly, one you're not really being honest about giving.
Like, he's not even gonna try to make an attempt to stop Kylo and Snoke? Out of all the choices that Ryan made for Luke's character, this is ultimately the worst of them all. The fact that he just gives up and abandons Leia and the other characters to clean up his mess and not bother to think about the consequences of his actions. Do you wanna know who else abandoned everyone to clean up their mess while not considering the consequences of their actions? Pink Diamond from Steven Universe. And the last thing you want is people comparing Luke Skywalker to Pink Diamond from Steven Universe.
You know, funny you should make this little Pink Diamond comparison, because that justifies Luke isolating himself in the first place. So, do you remember why Pink Diamond faked her own death? Probably not, considering how little you seem to understand anything. It was to stop the colonization of Earth, something she'd initially been trying to do by literally leading the rebellion against herself before the words of Blue Diamond convinced her that faking her own death was the best option. And the thing is that it actually worked. She stopped violence by removing the source of conflict, which was herself. So let's look at Luke's logic. The reason Ben finally turned, and the reason for the tragedy at the temple, was Luke's own actions. If Kylo was going to go after anyone, it would be Luke. So the best way to quell the conflict? Remove the side that you know to be wrong. If Luke believes that he was in the wrong, then one course of action that would make sense in his mind, not necessarily overall, mind you, but in his mind, would be to remove himself from the conflict, because he wasn't going to be able to be the one to end it. Just like Blue Diamond told Pink that the result she was trying to avoid was inevitable as long as she was even present, Luke also came to that conclusion. Except he didn't need somebody else's help in order to come to that conclusion. He came to that on his own. Does it make sense looking at it from an outside view? No, of course not. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't have to. The point is, if it makes sense from the character's point of view, which is something a lot of reviewers seem to miss when they just want to bash something, I've noticed.
This is not something that Luke would do. He would not give up. He would not lose all hope. He would not cut himself from the Force because he feels sorry for himself. He would not avoid responsibility for his mistakes. He would not leave his family and friends to deal with his problems. This is where I'm convinced that he is not Luke Skywalker.
And outright confirmation that your issue is the fact that Luke is the one doing this and not someone else. Like, you've been going on for 20 minutes and your entire issue is that the character didn't remain in stasis for 50 years in terms of personality, when that's not how things work.
This is not the childhood hero millions of people grew up with. This is a completely different character, an imposter.
Where's the body? I found Bane in electrical. I was headed up to do wires and he was on lights. You guys suck. You're dead, man. Oh, sure. Okay, so Jake, where were you? I was on cams. You see anybody leave electrical before I went in? Guys, this is ridiculous. The imposter is obviously Luke. Remember when I saw him standing in front of Kylo last round? Well, dude, every game with this shit. Shut the fuck up. You kidding me? Seriously, man. Bane, you're still dead.
Someone who doesn't deserve the title of Luke Skywalker. You want to make the argument that this is similar to what Obi-Wan and Yoda did in episode 3 when they went into hiding?
I mean, I wasn't even going to go there for reasons I'm about to point out, but that's actually a really good argument. Wait, did you just do my job for me?
Okay, let's draw the parallels. The Empire had just committed genocide against the Jedi while hunting and exterminating any survivors. They have no allies to help them in the open. They knew there was nothing they could do after the Order was destroyed and agreed to go into hiding until a new hope presented itself. They didn't isolate themselves out of self-pity or cowardice.
For one, you know, Kylo totally didn't just burn down an entire temple and went on a solo rampage. Totally didn't happen. No genocide, obviously right. Second of all, you're comparing the actions of two characters who are not Luke to the actions of Luke Skywalker while trying to say that Luke is acting in a way not befitting of his own character. Like, honestly, debunking your straw man is way easier than the way you do it here. Third of all, the thing you say next.
The Empire was too powerful for them to defeat by themselves.
Yeah, Luke also outright stated that one guy with a sword wasn't going to be the answer to taking down an entire empire. Look, it's hard to call you entirely wrong to say that Luke was cowardly, but at the same time, it's also really hard to call you entirely right at this point, and really hard to call that as objectively out of character as you make it out to be. So, hey, yo, Edit Monkey, can we skip to a point where he makes a different point? Nothing to skip here, dude. Also, like, we're the same person? This is weird.
And even during their exile, they still served a purpose: to watch over Luke and Leia and prepare them for the fight against the Empire. And on top of that, they still answered the call when their help was needed. Obi-Wan was ready to fly to Alderaan the instant he saw Leia's message and asked Luke to come with him. And when Luke found Yoda, he was eager and willing to train him to see if he had the patience to be a Jedi.
Okay, so I can kind of address both of these parts, because both of them needed to be asked for help and didn't go off running. again, if we're presenting them as the same character as Luke because you don't know how to fucking tell different characters apart, if they're at different points in the franchise, apparently, that would explain why Luke didn't go running off to drag Kylo back. Yoda, however, did not begin eager to teach Luke. He initially told him that he was too old. While this could be Yoda being the trickster god that we all know him to actually be, this could be compared to Luke not wanting to take an apprentice initially because of a past failing with one. Hell, both of them draw direct parallels. Yoda taking an older student being a parallel to Anakin, and Luke seeing Rey's willingness to go towards the dark side like Kylo, and himself. But there's another major difference to show why Obi-Wan was more willing to help when he got the message and why Yoda would come around. They knew who these people fucking were. Luke would have no reason to know anything about Rey, and then notice how he's much more willing to listen after seeing Chewie and hearing Rey's mention of the Millennium Falcon. When the familiarity is brought to him, he opens up to what's going on more, but it's a gradual process instead of all at once because they wanted to pace the movie in a different way. Kind of like how I ended that sentence, pacing it a different way.
Now let's look at Luke's situation. The Republic that he helped establish was evenly matched with the First Order. It wasn't a losing battle yet. All of his friends and allies were still alive and willing to help. Unlike Obi-Wan and Yoda, he just leaves himself to wallow in self-pity. He put forth no effort to make amends for his mistake before exiling himself. And when he was found, he refused to help even when being asked by Chewie, his friend over the last 30 years.
Actually, the point when he refuses to help is after the whole situation is explained to him. You know, the point when he says a guy with a sword isn't going to solve everything, and indicating that, you know, now he feels it's too late for him to help. It's almost like
Luke just ignores how billions are being slaughtered and didn't even give enough of a shit to check on the well-being of his sister. Apparently there's another factor that feeds into his loathing, in that he built into the legend that was built around him, but that's not in character for him either. Yes, he was reckless and pushed above his weight a few times in the OT, but he was also humbled by his experiences.
So, in other words, a reason why he wouldn't want to go into a fight he knows he's not going to win, like he felt he would be doing if he were to go into this fight now. Like, you just pointed to a piece of character development that shows why he wouldn't have joined the Resistance at this particular stage.
He wouldn't develop an ego and think of himself as the legendary Luke Skywalker. I'm pretty sure after losing his aunt and uncle, losing Obi-Wan, losing his hand, and Palpatine turning the tables on him in the throne room, he wouldn't be seeing himself as such a legend.
Which he doesn't? That's the point of that scene? Which is stated by the movie as a reason why he thinks Rey coming to get him to help is stupid? Your points for him being out of character are actively proving how in character all of this is. Do you actually have a brain, or is it just marshmallow flop up in there?
Luke became the greatest Jedi specifically because he didn't buy into his own hype like the others did. It's what made him special. It's pretty clear that Rian wanted to use Luke to tell a story about a fallen hero, but because of how horribly the film is paced and how so much of its runtime is wasted on pointless stuff, he doesn't properly develop this fallen hero storyline.
See, this one I kind of agree with you on. Kind of. I think Luke's story of the fallen hero would have worked better if it was given more time, but as you can tell from my responses, I don't think they did as bad of a job as you're claiming they did. If anything, this is the plot thread that probably needed some of the least extra time, really. But I think some of the things from being spelled out a little more overtly instead of relying on interpretation of dialogue would have suited this. Like, a better explanation within the movie of why he came to the decision he did to isolate himself, for example, even if just a line or two going through his thought process in the beginning.
Nothing that made his character the childhood icon that millions looked up to is present in this movie, except in the last 20 minutes where they abruptly kill him anyway. On some level I can understand if at some point Luke had to die, but the fact that Luke dies before doing anything meaningful to contribute to the story or advance the plot is a shameful way to send him off.
Bruh. For one, you previously said, in this section no less, that he only existed to tell the story Rian Johnson wants to tell. I spelled that with 2 H's for some reason, so which one is it? Ren's development is a huge part of the story, and a huge part of that is learning who Kylo Ren is. And of course, there's the fight against Kylo, where he is responsible for the escape of the Resistance, and, well, that fight is super relevant to the reasons I'll probably wind up getting to in a moment, because I have a gut feeling you're about to complain about it.
The optimism, determination, hopefulness, loyalty, strive to not give up no matter how hard things got, sense of responsibility, the will to fight and protect those he cares about. All of these things are dashed to serve a story where he isolates himself over a mistake he made and doesn't make an effort to fix it, with no rhyme or reason behind the chain of events.
While I agree with you that the shift could have been better explained, didn't you say you liked the concept of what they did with Luke in this movie? And this is why I say it's really only a couple of lines needed. We understand what happened over the past 20 years by watching this movie, but what happened in the previous 30 years that led him there isn't really touched on as much. His thought process of why he felt isolation was the right move was hinted at, but could use more overt explanation. But Luke's reluctance during this movie with what we're given makes a lot of sense. This is a franchise complaint more than the complaint about this movie. And even then, as I pointed out, your interpretation of just Last Jedi Luke bad doesn't exactly ring true.
This is by and large a form of character assassination. You remember my review of the MLP finale?
Of course you would go to MLP, fuck! So anyway.
This is basically the same thing. This is what happens when you don't understand the difference between a dynamic character change and warping them to the point of being unrecognizable from how they were portrayed in previous stories. They took a classic heroic character and messed up his personality so badly that you'd think he used to be an anti-hero or a villain. People change over time is not an excuse for such a stupid understanding for one of the most classic characters in the history of fiction.
Exaggeration, ho. That'd be you, by the way. So a lot of things you're complaining about I've already explained, but this is where the big overarching explanation for all this is. A lot of these things that you're complaining about are extensions of traits we already saw in the original trilogy. You even pointed out how he had some of these traits, but grew out of them, quote unquote. But for most of these, we have no real proof of him growing out of it. We have one time where he decided against killing someone when he had the chance. Something he literally does with Kylo. And sure, his impulsiveness and bravado from the originals are tempered, but that doesn't mean they're outright gone. People changing over time is exactly why the concept in and of itself works, my dude. And it is also why saying a character had flaws but grew out of them isn't good enough of a reason to say that those prior flaws can't reasonably resurface. Yeah, you don't like hearing that good enough line used against you, do ya?
If you want to characterize Luke as a broken man, that's one thing, but it would never play out the way it does in The Last Jedi. A better way to do it would be if he tried to save Kylo like he did Vader but failed, resulting in the death of his pupils that would damage his worldview. There's no scene showing that he tried to kill him and instead is replaced by scenes of him trying to persuade him.
Hey, you know what? I can agree with that. That would have been better. It also would have erased pretty much every problem, since it would allow something that is in character to serve as a catalyst for why he changes so much. So with this, I felt the darkness within him trying to pull me into it. Spoken in the voiceover right as he activates the lightsaber. But I resisted its pull. After he activates the lightsaber, then the line about being left with consequence. And leave everything else the same. Mine also ties into Luke's fear when he realized Rey wasn't resisting the dark side, but going towards it. In a sense, that moment communicates this idea, but indirectly. So, like I said, could have been more overt, but the explanation is there for interpretation.
And even after he fails, he wouldn't turn into an asshole. Maybe he'd be depressed, but he wouldn't turn into an asshole.
You are judging the fact that he's a smartass after 20 years of isolation is not reasonable. Sure. Like, he's not even that mean, dude. He's just a jaded old man, which is exactly what he would be.
You can't just take a heavily established character like Luke and change him to whatever the hell you want and say that it's because of a tragedy. That's cheating.
Sorry, you really sound like a toddler right now. Like, I don't really have anything else to say about that comment. It just sounds immature as fuck, my god. Actually, you know what? I do have something to say about it. Calling it cheating implies that while effective, it is a cheap tactic to use, even though it's literally the crux of the fallen hero trope, which you said would be fine. I just fucking can't, dude.
The problem isn't so much that Luke is grumpy and pessimistic, the problem is the reasons that we're told why he's grumpy and pessimistic.
So don't make him an asshole. But if you change the reasons for it, I'll still be cool with him being an asshole. Bruh.
If you want to make the argument that this was done to show how Luke is a flawed character who makes mistakes, he was already a flawed character who made mistakes in the OT.
Which means that, of course, you're not allowed to show those flaws in this movie. Even though you wanted them to expand on the mistakes of the Jedi Council that we saw overtly in previous films. I fucking can't with you, bro.
And not only was this already covered in the OT, but it was executed to better writing and received results. He convinced Uncle Owen to buy the droids that led the Empire to his house, resulting in his family's death. Even if he was there, he wouldn't have made a difference as deducted by Obi-Wan. And while he does contribute to Leia's rescue, he's also saved several times by Leia, Han, and even R2-D2. It's blatantly obvious that he's much less experienced under life or death pressure than his comrades. He was barely able to survive the attack on the Death Star before Han helped create an opening for him to make a miraculous shot that Obi-Wan particularly coached him through. He was wounded, captured, and barely escaped a Wampa on Hoth before being saved by Han again. He achieved one victory in the barely successful Rebel evacuation where a lot of people died. He didn't save his friends at Cloud City and was toyed around with Vader throughout their duel before being soundly defeated after one lucky shot. His friends escaped on their own and he had to be saved after his reckless rescue attempt. Even after becoming a competent Jedi, he's covered by his friends from attacks by Jabba's minions and saved yet again by Han through his defeat of Boba Fett. In the final battle, he was tempted by the dark side through Vader's emotional manipulation, was helpless against Palpatine's Sith lightning, and was saved by his father whose redemption was his greatest victory. When you count the conflicts in Luke's development, he actually loses most of these fights or isn't strong enough to affect the outcome alone. This was a way of showing how he was properly flawed because he wasn't able to do everything by himself, which taught him humility and discipline, something that the sequel trilogy completely forgets about.
But he developed past all those things by your own logic, so, doesn't count. But what was that about being tempted by the dark side again? In a scene that fucking mirrors what happened in the flashback in this fucking movie, where he draws his lightsaber, but reconsiders, only this time, him drawing his lightsaber in the first place has consequences? You could argue that in Return of the Jedi, his struggle with taking a life is in the heat of the battle, while this isn't, but I can turn that around too. PTSD is a thing, and someone taught to be a warrior can have the instincts of one when a relevant situation arises, an instinct he has to actively suppress. The movie doesn't directly communicate this, no, but by having the two moments use similar character positioning, it actually does communicate the idea, for those who actually pay fucking attention.
It's one thing to commit an action that negatively affects you and others, but another thing entirely to betray core values, including ones outside of the Jedi philosophy, painstakingly forged through decades of struggle. This ultimately results in Luke essentially relearning the same stuff he learned in the OT, but 100 times weaker. If 35 years of experience drilled the message in so poorly that he'd sink this low, it's twice as frustrating that Yoda's pep talk was all it took to set him straight again. Luke's journey in the OT involved learning and improving from failure, which renders his quickness to consider killing Kylo and his inability to learn from failing his new students insulting to how little he retained from these lessons.
Keep that in mind about the moment of weakness. It's going to come up in my next interjection. But about that failing his students, what did he learn in the OT about having students, or about failing those who are trying to learn from him? You said it yourself. He was the inexperienced one in the group in the original trilogy. So what would he know about dealing with failure when he's the one in charge? It makes sense that's something he hasn't learned how to handle, especially given the catastrophic results of when it did happen.
Obviously, people can repeat a mistake after learning from it, but this wasn't just a mistake. This was a departure from the accumulation of everything that defines him, after 3 films and nearly 20 years of experience prior to The Force Awakens. It portrays Luke as not having matured at all, and he's painted as so emotionally fragile, despite being older and wiser than he and Anakin were the last time either of their feelings blinded them, that he forgets even for a second of instinct to weigh the consequences.
I'm going to pause right there. You are literally saying that a moment of weakness is fine, but then get onto him for having what you describe as a second of instinct. So it's fine to have a moment of weakness as long as it's not a moment of weakness.
And what makes this so particularly nasty is that it was clearly written this way to put Rey on a pedestal, to make her appear superior to him as the new protagonist. You gotta kill him so she can take both his and Anakin's place as the one who ultimately defeats Palpatine.
Or, he was written that way because it made no fucking sense for him to be the protagonist of this trilogy. So they needed to give him a different role if they were to include him at all. Like, he spends a ton of the movie telling her how wrong her fairy tale viewpoint of how shit works is. He tells her that going to Kylo won't go the way she thinks it will, and he's completely right. How? How is the movie portraying Rey as better than Luke when she's actively asking him to teach her? And when he teaches her something, she doesn't listen and it goes bad.
Because Kathleen Kennedy wants a woman to be the ultimate hero and not a man.
Are you fucking serious right now? Okay, I'll get more into your whole feminist propaganda bit and how all of this is really just disguising the fact that you're mad that Rey's not a guy. But let me address this image in particular. So about the Force is female. I know you're going to mention it in your Kathleen Kennedy segment. I don't give a fuck. I'm going to address it here. Yeah, I'm not going to say that Kathleen Kennedy had no intention to evoke this as a Star Wars related message when she wore a shirt everybody else was wearing at a film festival for high school girls. But the slogan's codification was previously with Nike and an ad campaign for Air Force Ones, otherwise known as Forces. I'm aware you're too white to know what good shoes are, but first of all, good job proving you're whiter than me. I forgot I wrote that in my script. Not that it takes much. You are a brony talking about Star Wars, but still. Second of all this really amounts to at the end of the day, some loose threads you can dangle around and pretend mean something when they don't. The Force is female wasn't even associated with Star Wars in any fashion until Kathleen decided to quote Yoda before saying a tagline for a film festival that had nothing to do with Star Wars. I'm sure I'll get deeper on this when I get deeper on your Kathleen Kennedy segment. Spoiler warning, I actually won't very much. But yeah, just going ahead and calling this out now. This is not a deliberate, overt Star Wars connection to feminism. Woman just likes her some white on whites. What the fuck am I saying? I don't know Kathleen's color scheme for her forces. I wear white on whites though, in case anybody was wondering.
In the words of Angry Joe in his Right to Hell Retribution video,
see you guys on the next—
Fuck that!
Gotta say, being that angry over having a female protagonist in Star Wars, not a good look if I'm being honest with you, Broseph.
And throughout this entire charade, he doesn't even have a meaningful relationship with her in this movie. You expected something on par with the relationship between Luke and Yoda in episode 5? Well, here's an entire third of the movie dedicated to Finn and Rose running around in circles and Poe and Holdo arguing over an escape plan. The relationship between Luke and Rey isn't important enough for that leftover screen time.
Well, you know, if we're gonna compare it, Luke Skywalker had 23 minutes and 45 seconds of screen time in The Last Jedi. We can compare that with how much screen time Yoda had, which was 16 minutes and 30 seconds in the entire original trilogy. So Luke had more screen time than Yoda when we compare the two mentors. So the time the two had to spend on screen was clearly not the issue when it comes to developing the relationship. But maybe because of the backstory, the fact that there was more screen time given to other subplots intervened. All right. Rose and Finn each had 15:45 and 18:45 respectively. Luke has 5 minutes more screen time than either one of them, which covers most, if not all, the screen time of Luke's backstory explanations where he would actually be on screen. So that's about out. I don't know the exact numbers for Poe or Holdo, but I do know that the figure has to be somewhere between 2 minutes and 15 minutes. I'm aware that's broad. So their plot also has far less screen time than Luke and Rey. What I'm saying is that most of the movie is Luke and Rey. I'm not even disagreeing with you that the movie's runtime and number of subplots was the prime issue with the film. But as the numbers show, they don't exactly prevent the story from being told outright. and not in a way that's really that relevant to Empire Strikes Back.
Why was that so hard? Why didn't they give us actual scenes of the two training together and developing an authentic student and teacher relationship? We could have gotten something like the one between Miles and Peter from Into the Spider-Verse. I'd even say that Miles and Peter are Rey and Luke done properly.
But didn't you say earlier that the tone of Marvel movies isn't suitable for Star Wars because it's supposed to be more serious? Yeah. Some more of those outright contradictions come out when you realize that you're talking to somebody who can actually remember what you said 2 hours ago.
Miles didn't immediately master his powers because he was still learning about being a spider person. He needed Peter to teach him and went through an arc about not only harnessing his powers, but to understand himself better as a person. Meanwhile, Peter was going through disillusion since his life ended up going through a downward spiral, but his iconic personality is still there for those who are familiar with the character. He humbly takes Miles under his wing and shows how he has 20 years of experience, but also goes through an arc about trying to turn his life around and take his own leap of faith in starting over. Both Miles and Peter end up learning from each other throughout the course of the movie, so there's a real sense of student and teacher chemistry between them.
So, for one, comparing those relationships is a little bit moot when this is Miles just now getting his powers, and Rey in this film already has her powers, basically. There's also a significant difference between Peter's and Luke's activities in the stories that are relevant to the character. Peter isn't really self-isolating and still at that moment actively trying to save the world. Luke, for various reasons, doesn't want to do that. Hell, do you remember where Luke tells Rey that she shouldn't go to Kylo? She offers him the lightsaber to join the fight so that she doesn't have to take that option, and he refuses. Meanwhile, Peter, in Into the Spider-Verse, actually restrains Miles to deal with a situation himself that's out of Miles' league. However, for the story in Last Jedi to work properly, it makes the most sense that Rey letting the lessons from Luke sink in happened from seeing the consequences firsthand. You know, much like Luke with Yoda. Luke was trying to curb her optimism and Rey didn't listen to him, much like where Yoda told Luke not to rush into action, but Luke did not listen to him. This aspect of Luke trying to help Rey think more logically about what she's doing at this point, instead of letting her emotions carry her, is expressed by a single line. This isn't going to end the way you think it's going to. How would Luke know that? Because he lived through the consequences of it. Now, onto the argument that this leads to, that's also bullshit.
Point to me at the moment where anything like what happened in that movie happened here. You can't, because nothing like that happens between Luke and Rey. Yes, they have conversations, but Rey isn't learning anything.
So, Luke teaching her the true nature of the Force when all she really knows is moving rocks, that's not her learning anything. Of course, if she doesn't learn anything because she's not retaining what Luke is telling her, that would be a fair argument. You know, if not for the fact that Luke doesn't retain what Yoda taught him during Empire either, considering he makes the same mistake that she does. But I can also use your earlier argument against this one. So you say Rey doesn't learn anything, but earlier complained about how she's so suddenly a match for Kylo Ren and able to take on guards in Snoke's chamber. Okay, so how did she improve from barely being able to contend with a wounded Kylo that already fought Finn to being that powerful? Well, since the only thing we see in both movies between now and then is Rey being trained by Luke, it seems like the logical thing is that what Luke was telling her helped her improve her capabilities, right? And look at her saber technique during that scene. It is much more technical than the wild brawling swinging that she was doing in the first movie. And where would she learn those saber techniques? I mean, we do actively see her practicing. Oh, but it's with a stick, but it doesn't count, even though she's actually doing actual moves with the stick. Whatever. And we see Luke watching her practice, so we can say it's shown in the movie that Luke is guiding her practice with the lightsaber, even if he's not actively practicing alongside her. It's almost like they showed that Rey was practicing, rather than telling us that Rey had improved. They showed the improvement instead of telling us about it. Funny how so many people who complain about show don't tell seem to miss the concept when the movie actually fucking does it.
And they're not developing a relationship on top of those conversations. 90% of the dialogue between these two is empty exposition. Here's a small recap of what happened in the last movie. Here's an explanation of what's left of the Jedi. Here's a small reminder that the Jedi were idiots. Here's a reminder that you used to be cool. Here's a flashback I had about Kylo becoming a bad guy. Here's me demanding the truth. Here's an alternate flashback explaining my dumbass decision to kill Kylo. Here's me telling you I can save him even though I have no reason to want to save him after he murdered his father and my surrogate dad in cold blood in front of me.
You skipped a few scenes in there? But alright, let's talk about those conversations. We catch the tail end of that synopsis of the last movie, and Luke's continued refusal at that point, followed by scenes that show both characters' stubbornness and resolve in mirrored fashion. Rey not giving up on Luke during the fight, and Luke being persistent in his refusal and attempting to live his life the way he already had. Even though there's no dialogue, the fact that both are showing the same character trait in different ways, combined with a shot of Luke looking back when Rey strays, shows that Rey's actions are getting through to Luke in a way that her words cannot. So, about that exposition about Jedi texts. Yeah, that's like one line, and is used to transition to Luke asking questions about Rey. Notably, during this, his question becomes less and less pointed towards the surface level and to a deeper meaning. Luke doesn't become willing to teach Rey during the scene, but he starts being willing to answer her, even if the answers are coming painfully and slowly. R2-D2 is the one who wound up taking the final step in convincing Luke to train Rey, but the fact of the matter is, Rey's determination is shown with very little dialogue to do so, mind you, as part of what gets him to open up. Rey has a connection with people of Luke's past, and it's that connection that slowly opens that door for Rey. Yeah, we'll go over the other scene that you skipped, and did so intentionally, mind you, in a moment, but let's get to the scene you actually talk about. That exposition is necessary because it explains why Luke feels the way that he feels. The statement at the end is really all that's needed for the personal connection to be part of it. Like, Rey responding to learning this with conviction that Kylo is the one in the wrong, and it also explains why she would want answers when she later finds out that there's more to Luke's actions. So, about that last part. Yeah, it's not like there was a build-up to her demanding the whole truth and knowing there was more than just what Luke had told her. It's not like she went into that dark place and seemed to be pulled towards the dark side, thus her aggression. Like, there's so many reasons why the no reason to trust him thing is wrong, including saying she saw his future when she touched his hand, and the fact you know about the flashback changing with each explanation proves that you are fully aware that your explanation for Luke's past actions is misguided at best and outright misleading at worst. And I'd lean towards the worst in your case, all things considered. But back to that scene that you skipped over intentionally.
The closest thing I can think of to a genuine moment of connection between them is that one scene of Luke teaching Rey about the Force. But the moment is cut short just to introduce that dark hole of temptation that amounts to nothing.
Okay, so for one, Luke explains what she's learned before the darkness comes forth. Even in the initial explanation of it, Luke is telling her how it makes sense. He expresses fear that she didn't fight against the darkness. Like, it's part of the connection between the two characters that scene displays. Are you fucking kidding me? Now, let's address the comment of that hole amounts to nothing. You know the mirror scene? That takes place in the dark hole. That scene after she goes in the dark hole is immediately followed by her forming a bond with Kylo Ren, which is what sets off her going to him and trying to get him to turn. You know, one of the most important parts of the movie. A scene that you also use to explain your problems with Rey's character by stating that your interpretation is that it was showing her a representation of her fear and her weakness. Which, you know, is pretty fucking important. So, what I'm getting at here is that you're just lying. Cool.
And this line of dialogue that makes no sense.
I've seen this raw strength only once before, and then Solo. It didn't scare me enough then. It does now.
I just love that Luke is saying Kylo's power didn't scare him back then, despite that he immediately considered and even almost went through killing him, but now that it does scare him, he's gonna want to keep Rey under his wing and offer her some more lessons without wanting to force choke her.
First of all, didn't scare him. He didn't even say he was afraid back then. He said he thought he could stop it. Like, He even accentuated the word in the dialogue. Are you serious right now? I can even see you equating what he's talking about to the darkness, even though I would disagree with that since he specifies raw power. But since it happened after the encounter with darkness calling to Rey, I can get the interpretation there at the very least, but making it out like he's saying it didn't scare him at all, given the intonation, a bit dishonest. I'm getting used to that by now, though. But there's another explanation for this line that I can present. Notice how he says this only after Rey figures out that he's cut himself off from the Force. Couldn't this also be an explanation of why he cut himself off from the Force? Oh, that reminds me. You know how you kept saying him cutting himself off from the Force prevents him from checking in on Han and Leia? He literally does that a couple of scenes later. So, real easy for him to just pick it back up when he feels it's necessary. You know, like when he's starting to change his mind about his course of actions because of someone being able to get through to him. Weird, it's almost like you're accidentally explaining why this movie does a good job.
Rewrites, rereads, proof-checking the script? What are those, Mr. Johnson?
Ah, proofreading! Like the thing you didn't do with your script. Bro, I've got like 104 pages of complaints about your video so far. What the fuck are you even wearing right now? That ain't Gucci, that's Gucci, fam.
When there are fan fictions with more consistent writing than this, all I'm left wondering is where did a good chunk of those $3 million go? The visuals and special effects I can understand, but let's be real, it sure as fuck was not spent on this script.
That's not even how scripts work. Spending more money on the scripting has no bearing on how good it is, other than maybe having more people on staff, and even that can wind up more of a hindrance than a help. You even talk about the special effects, which cost money. And motherfucker, Benicio del Toro is in this movie. Where did all the budget go? Showing a cat turd, my guy.
Changing Luke's character so drastically requires further depth and context, something this movie severely lacks. What was even the purpose of this? Why would you take one of the most iconic heroes in the history of film and turn him into a depressed hermit? To the point where even Mark Hamill is admitting to it.
I'm not playing your clips. Like, okay, for one, in one of those clips, he outright admits that it's just a him problem. And he also said at South by Southwest in 2018 that he shouldn't have made that public. And you want to know why? Clashes like this are normal. They are a typical part of the creative process. He even explicitly talked about that happening with Return of the Jedi. And that interview was in 2018, so, you know, good on you for ignoring it. We're also going to ignore that a large amount of what Mark says in your clips are jokes, even, or the fact that a good amount of it is him intentionally not spoiling the movie and just saying it's different from what he was expecting to do. That being said, I'm skipping all of it because the South by Southwest Q&A debunks every single thing that is said there.
A mess.
That's disgusting. What a shitty way to treat a genuinely good person like Mark Hamill. He wasn't in it for the money or the fame. He really cared about the difference he was making in the world by playing the role of Luke Skywalker.
Okay, so for one, not mutually exclusive. You could care about the money and still also be passionate about the art. You think I would be writing this much on your ass if I wasn't passionate about this? Fuck no. And yet I also place ads on the video. It's almost like I want to be able to eat food as well, and using what I'm passionate about to do that, it's fulfilling to me. Second of all, here's one of your clips from earlier.
We're never going to catch lightning in a bottle again. We had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's let the memories suffice. And I said, you know what? My out is that Harrison's never going to do.
Passionate about Star Wars in general? Probably, yeah. Willing to collect a paycheck for a nostalgia pop? Also, yes. Go fuck yourself.
Oh my God, the side of Rachel that came up, stank pussy hoe. I was done. I was dead. I was deceased. I needed to be dragged out of the room. My corpse on the floor. I was resuscitated to be here right now. A mess. A mess.